identify something unknown and begin to understand what is your strategy to understand the difference between connective tissue and healing tissue and so forth. So that's what he's going to do. But before we get to that, I want to answer a lot of questions that you may be thinking now, or if you're not thinking, you should be thinking. And that's about the quiz that you have on Friday. So the logistics will be updated and posted on CBase. Half the class will take the exam in this room, and half the class will take the exam in the Mark Auditorium. It will be exam soft based, so you will be getting a friendly email from Neil Clenahan telling you that your quiz is ready for downloading. And do that following before you come into the exam. The exam will be 32 multiple choice questions. It will cover the material, all the material that Dr. Cameron presented to you this past week, ranging from nervous tissue, epithelial tissue in the various forms, muscle tissue, connective tissue, including bone as well. Including on the exam is the presentations on Wednesday. So Dr. Lazo will be correlating some gross and microscopic features of dermatologic disease of skin, both at the gross and microscopic level. So at the gross level, he's going to be showing you some manifestations of diseases that you will be seeing throughout the course as we go through infectious disease processes, for example, in pathogens and host defense. And then in the afternoon, I will be doing blood cell morphology for you. So those topics will be on the exam as well. So the style of, there are essentially two general style of questions. One style of question is a conceptual question. So if you recall the way the material has been presented to you, Dr. Cameron will introduce a tissue type, describe for you some important features of both its morphology and function, and the type of function that we need to know at this point in time about the different cells. So it's important to understand that entree into subsequent comparison of the different cell types, their key morphologic features, and so forth. So today, related to that, he's going to compare many different cells for you and ask you to identify what some of those features are. So one type of question will be text-based only, which will address some fundamental feature. Those will comprise a small portion of the exam, maybe 15%. The predominance of the questions will include images. They will be digital images of the tissue types and their relationships. They will either be an image, in some situations there may be more than one image if I need to show you low and high power magnification. And in many situations there will be at least one or two arrows to point you to a specific region of the tissue or a specific area of a cell type if that is a critical feature. So the questions related to it are not simply going to say, what is this? But it will sometimes ask you to understand what role something plays, if that is how it has been presented to you, or relationships or functional features of those. So it's important in understanding fundamental histology is to understand that this is presented to you in the context of the structure-function relationship. Granted that we don't know that you haven't been taught yet many of the fine functional activities, but certainly some overarching functions of the different tissues and also their relationships to one another. So that's something to keep in mind as you review and prepare for the upcoming quiz. So in terms of resources, there are several resources that have been presented to you. One is the presentations in each class that Dr. Cameron has done in terms of taking you through the cell types, explaining to you how you look at the particular tissue, what are you looking for, what are the salient features of a particular tissue cell type that leads to a tissue and ultimately leads to an organ or organ system. And he'll review some more of that this afternoon. The other major resource is the digital histology manual and its components that we have posted on CBase for you. And that includes the chapters for each that are assigned at each session. And each chapter has associated with it images. And then there are problem sets that accompany all of that. And when you examine the problem sets, you'll see that they're essentially asked to you in an open-ended manner, which I think is a good way to do it rather than selecting multiple choice, because it makes you think. Makes you think about something, and when you look at the annotations, it'll help explain the reasons why it's one type of cell or tissue and not the other. So those are very valuable resources for you to prepare, and those resources will help you be very successful on the quiz. They have been successful for students historically, so it should continue to be successful. With that, I'll take any questions you have either about logistics, about any other issues, about question number 27, whatever it is that you might want to know before Dr. Cameron takes over the business. So information about where to go will be posted on CBase, and if there are other questions, I'm going to hand the mic over to you.
There's a question.
Sorry, it's 32 questions. How much time?
It's 32 questions. You have 1 hour.
Thank you.
Okay, it's nice to see you guys again. Hope you had a nice weekend. I wanted to actually start today by telling you a brief experience that I had some years ago, and that is, I think one thing we all have in common is we had to take gross anatomy. And when I took gross anatomy as a graduate student, I got preferential treatment because we were assigned, the graduate students made up a group, and we were assigned a cadaver that was this little skinny guy. And as opposed to the other students that tended to have heavier set individuals. So we did our dissection. It came time for the first exam. I went up to the first station where something was pinned. Cadaver was on his back, and I had never seen what was pinned in the first question. Now, it was the trapezius muscle, arguably the simplest things there is, but on our cadaver, the trapezius muscle was, I don't know, like maybe 2 or 3 millimeters thick, and it looked really pale. And the cadaver that I went to for the first station, this thing was like 1 inch thick, and it had big muscular guy, and it was red, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm looking at. So, of course, I panicked and nearly failed the exam. So, I'm telling you this for a reason, and that is what the secret to any anatomy exam is, or any anatomy experience is not only what it looks like, but it's the structural relationships. So if I would have paid attention to the fact that, all right, it's got, it's probably a muscle, right? And then the guy's on his back, so it's one of the back muscles, and it's attaching from here to here. Didn't matter what it looked like. So the same is true for histology. Now, you will argue about, in your mind, with me about this. You'll say, oh yeah, the thing that's stained purple, I know that's this. So your mind is going to make these connections. And to a certain extent, you're correct, because I only have a finite amount of histological material. So, if I had the same tissue type stained 5 different ways, it might be one thing, but I only have that. But I still want to stress, it's about structural relationships. So what happened last week was, as I went through the various tissues with you, I was describing stuff. I'm sure you recall some of it. It's got a centrally placed nucleus, it's got a this, it's got a that. So my first point today, I think, is probably the most important one, and that is every cell type, tissue type, structure that you're expected to recognize all has a description, a word description. Hopefully you got most of that from the live presentations here in the room. There's text in the histology manual. I wouldn't worry so much about that text. I mean, if you can go through those figures with the sort of, elaborate figure legends, I think you're in good shape, and the problem sets, I think, are a very likely indicator of your success. But my point is this: go more on structural relationships and less on what it actually, looks like. Your eye is like, oh yeah, if it's purple, it's this. Although those observations are important from time to time in smart staining, all right? So, I am going to now today, I'm going to approach this, and I gave some thought to this, and how do you actually do a review? Well, you can't reteach everything, there's not enough time to do that, and I don't think you can benefit from it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you some classic, what we like to refer to as histo-lookalikes. These are things that appear similar, and I'm going to stress the details about what makes them different. And so I want you to sit back, I want you to think. I don't want you to panic if you don't know the answers to these things, because this will be a fairly challenging way to go through this, but I think everyone will end up stronger on the back end of this by having gone through the relevant things. Now, there might be things that you want to see. So I certainly will be taking requests as we go. And so I thought about how to do this too, and I think the easiest way is just raise your hand. If I don't notice you, just yell out and we'll talk about it. And in fact, as we do the comparisons, I'll mention stuff, and if you're confused, chances are that your classmates are too, so just shout these things out. All right, so that's what we're gonna do. So hopefully you will find this useful, and again, if you're confused as to what you're looking at, don't panic, we're gonna talk our way through it. So this can be an overwhelming challenge, but I have always tried to take the easy way in everything that I've ever done in life. So this is the easiest way to learn it, and that's what I'm gonna teach you. All right? You guys ready? Yeah, here we go. I'll start you off. The pointer's in the lumen right here. What is the tissue type that lines that lumen? Now, this is a rhetorical question. You don't have to yell these things out. So I want you to think about this a little bit. Now, hi Neil. So when you think about, if you are completely confused, and hopefully you aren't, but if you are completely confused, remember this. There's only 4 tissue types, so it's got to be one of them, right? Is nerve, muscle, epithelia, connective. Which one is this? It's a lumen, remember, a body surface, so it's got to be an epithelium. All right, so good. We've narrowed muscle, nerve, it's not that, it's not connective tissue, it is an epithelium. How many layers do you see? Now this is where things get a little challenging, right? Because I chose this image on purpose because plane of section issues and so forth come into play. I'm gonna say, well, what do you guys think? Go ahead, just you can yell them out. Is it simple or stratified? Both? Somebody said both. A lot of you said both. Okay, so all I'm hearing is mumble, mumble. So it's not both. So never do that. It's not both. It's one of them. So if you had to choose one, simple or columnar, what do you think you go with? Simple, right? Because you see through here, that's gotta be simple. There can't be more than one layer, and here they get a little jumbled, but it's still more or less simple. So name the tissue type. What is it? Simple columnar, agreed. Very good. Oh, but wait. That is a correct statement, but I want to just move over here for a second and show you, look at right here. This is the lumen. What's that stuff right there? Those are cilia. Wait a minute, cilia on a simple columnar? Is that possible? Well, yeah, because we're looking at it, right? So, yes, it is possible. Now, recognize you haven't seen everything in the body yet. But this is something you haven't seen. This is an example of a simple columnar epithelium in which many of the cells are ciliated. Okay, so keep this image in mind. And now, let's look at the following. So, oh, nice. Just drop the slide right in there. Are you okay? Okay. I don't like it. So. All right, bear with me.
Stereocilia is more widely distributed.
There's a lot of colors.
Yeah, like
Teal is kind of
right. It's not like
What's that one? Pseudostratified. All right, so pseudostratified is one of the more challenging, well, I shouldn't say challenging, but it's one of these where you need to see some things. And that is, does the simple presence of goblet cells, is that enough? The answer is no, because goblet cells appear elsewhere. So, the presence of goblet cells coupled with, again, here we are cilia, but this is not simple columnar. So agreed, this is pseudostratified. So what are the things you should be looking for? Well, honestly, I don't know, how critically important this is, but remember I said that they have this particular epithelium has an extremely thick basement membrane, and that's number one. Number two, the presence of multiple cell types, goblet, but the other cell that you need to see are ciliated cells. And then the fact is that you have these basal cells here. Brush cells may or may not be in the plane of section simply because they're relatively rare. But you'll almost always see basal cells, ciliated cells, and goblet cells. Those are the kind of images that we'll always show you. And that's going to be pseudostratified. Now keep in mind, this is a simple epithelium. Now the simple epithelium is defined as every cell touches the basement membrane. Not every cell makes it to the lumen. So in this case, basal cells certainly don't make it to the lumen, but they do touch the basement membrane. And on the other end, you have ciliated cells and goblet cells. They do touch the basement membrane. Okay? So,
Question.
go.
So, do we say pseudostratified epithelium or pseudostratified columnar epithelium?
Oh, yeah. I guess its full name technically is pseudostratified columnar epithelium, although I would probably say pseudostratified all the time.
Also, does it always have these 4 cell types?
Yes. Well, okay. So now you're making me think. Okay, so there are examples in the reproductive systems in which tissues are called pseudostratified. You will not be held accountable for that right now. By this time next year, you will be held accountable, but this will be so old that it'll be trivial. So pseudostratified at this stage of your education is that. So there must be other cells. You have a question? Where's the cilia? The cilia aren't as clear as the last one, but they're this wispy stuff right here. Key feature, this red line right along the surface, that's the cell, that's the apical membrane, so all this stuff is sticking out in the lumen. And because it's sticking out so far, you know, it's not microvilli, it's actually cilia. Okay, so let's look at something completely different. All right, everybody comfortable so far? All right, like I said, let's do something completely different. And there it's completely different. Okay. So, is it nerve? Is it epithelia? Is it connective? No. It's muscle. And you know what else it is? It's striated muscle. If I focus up and down on this, and the nice thing about giving these exams on by digital image is here on your computer screen, it appears really good. Like here, for example, where did I see? Yeah, you can really kind of see striations through here and through here. Okay, it's striated. So we have two choices, skeletal or cardiac. Is anyone in doubt as to what this is? This is cardiac. Why is it cardiac? A bunch of reasons. Again, now that one wasn't yours. You don't have to like say. Okay, centrally placed nuclei. Gotta be cardiac. Skeletal's on the periphery. These cells are branching. Skeletal never does that. These things are called intercalated discs. Skeletal doesn't do that. Okay, so there is an example of cardiac muscle in longitudinal section. Question. The pointer is now, you can't really see it, but right here, what is this tissue? Is that cardiac muscle too? No, it's not cardiac muscle because the cells aren't striated. So, what is it? Well, in doubt, go with connective, right? So in other words, it connects things, and this is connective. In fact, if I drop this image down a little bit, here's a nice field of it right here. So what kind of connective tissue is that? Is it adipose? No, because you don't see the cells with the round things, the round adipocytes, you don't see that. So it's not adipose, it's obviously not fetal, so it's not mesenchyme or mucoid because that's full-blown cardiac muscle. So it's not reticular because you don't see any lymphocytes. So it's fibroelastic connective tissue, but we're not done yet. Is it loose, dense irregular, or dense regular? We have those three choices. Yeah, now, this is where things you're starting to be confronted with the reality of things. I gave you a general definition of loose where I said there's usually more than one cell type, but that's not always the case. There probably are more than one cell type here, but they're not easily recognizable. But the density of the collagen, or the size of the collagen, which is small, and the amount of ground substance, which is the white stuff, the white spaces, that's a lot. That's loose fibroelastic connective tissue. It's in between these cardiac muscle cells. Okay, so again, remember we were doing histolookalikes. So let's make sure that we can contrast this with the other striated muscle. Which is this. Okay, that's nice and striated, right? See that? Like this one right here. What makes this skeletal and not cardiac? Well, you don't see any branching. Now, granted, if we went down the slide, you know, it might be branching, but remember, you're gonna be asked questions which provide you with most, if not all, the relevant structural features. So this would be a decent example of that. So, no branching, key feature, where are the nuclei? See how they're on the surface? They're not inside the cell. Now you may say, oh, well, what about that one right there? Well, here's the next principle. Plane of section, right? So in other words, that just happened to, you know, graze one. So the only way you can deal with this is go with the prevailing pattern that you see. Don't focus on the exceptions. You know, one of the things that will serve you well in medical school and dental school is to get a good grasp of the obvious and don't let go. So in other words, don't be shaken and say, oh, look at this. There's a nucleus right here. That's right in the middle of the cell. I'm going with cardiac. Just because I know Cameron's wrong. You know, and so you might do that, but you're going to get it wrong, and I'm going to feel just fine about it because I told you that go with the prevailing pattern. So there are exceptions, granted. So we're going to choose these images that, again, make it as clear cut as possible, but go with the prevailing pattern, which is these nuclei right here, and in here, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so enough sick. All right, let's do another look-alike. Okay. What is, I'm sorry to be late for this. What is this tissue type? Now again, I have no idea what I'm looking at. Well, is it nerve, muscle, epithelia, or connective? See how that helps? See our body surface, it's got to be an epithelium. Step 2, is it simple or stratified? This one's definitely stratified, right? There are cells out here which can't possibly touch the basement membrane. But now we've got a decision to make. Is it stratified columnar? Cells columnar? You name it by the surface ones? No. Because remember, if it's columnar, the rectangles have to be perpendicular to the long axis, so it's not that. Stratified cuboidal. No, those cells are not cuboidal. Why do I know that? Because a cuboidal cell will have a round nucleus or oval, not this. But now here is the dilemma. Is this stratified squamous or is it transitional? You probably didn't even think about transition, did you? Wow, big. Firm grasp, obvious, don't let go. Stratified squamous. If it was transitional, these surface cells would have to be a lot more columnar looking, but simply on their side, long axis parallel to the basement membrane. So this is stratified squamous. Of course, incompletely characterized. Okay? Now just to drive that point home, exact same image that I showed you, but it just really illustrates the point nicely. Here's this tissue right here. These cells are not squamous. You may say, oh, that looks good to me. Well, except the problem is the nuclei. You don't have oval nuclei in a squamous setting. They're squished. And so I'm going with transitional for this one, simply because these are those cap cells that sit along. So anyway, again, I'm just helping you, I'm hopefully helping you. I'm trying to do histolookalikes. Now while I'm here, this, where the arrow is right here versus the arrow right here. Let me ask you a question. Is that the same tissue type? Here versus here. That is not the same tissue type. What do you suppose this tissue type is? What do you think? Again, is it muscle? Nerve? No. It's not an epithelium because it's not bordering a lumen. It's connective tissue. So, if you run through the connective tissues, fibroelastic connective tissue, but now the question is this loose or dense irregular? What do you think? I'm going to go with dense irregular on this, simply because it's not lined up enough. That is, the collagen is not lined up in these big fibers. This, do you guys have any idea what that is? It's not connective tissue. Because I want you to think about the context. If this is connective tissue, you normally don't have another completely different looking connective tissue right there. I mean, well, a little careful about that. It's obviously different. So if I showed you this, is that helpful? See how it's staying the same, just different orientation? That's smooth muscle. This is smooth muscle in longitudinal section. Remember I said always check the context. This is smooth muscle cut in cross section. Definitely challenging, I agree. But anyway, notice I want to draw your attention to the staining difference. Muscle always stains denser than connective tissue. And why is that? Because muscle cells, even smooth muscle, is made of actin and myosin. Those are dense proteins. Versus connective tissue is collagen, not the same. So muscle always stains deeper. Okay. Okay, so here's your image. Okay, there it is. Like Dr. Flynn said, we're gonna make sure that the magnification is not an issue. Anyway, here's your question. What is that cell type? What is that cell called? The name of the cell type? Primary afferent neuron. Okay, so let's go through some stuff. Did everybody recognize its nervous tissue? Good. Here's your first question, once you got the nervous tissue down, and that is the it's the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. So what are some clues this is the peripheral nervous system? Well, if you notice, you don't have gray matter versus white matter. Instead, you got some stuff over here, which is connective tissue, once again. And here, inside here, you've got neurons and then this stuff right here, which is fiber tracts. So hopefully you can see, if it's central nervous system, that means spinal cord. You got to see, you have to see evidence of a spinal cord. We're not seeing that here. So once you've established it's a peripheral nervous system, what makes you so confident that that's a primary afferent neuron? Well, where's the nucleus? Centrally placed. If this was some other neuron in the peripheral nervous system, where would the nucleus be? Eccentric. Number two, this kind of gives it away. What's that stuff right there? That's Nissl substance. No, something wrong. Think, that's right, think before I speak. Lipofuscin granules. That tends to be associated with these cells. Number three, although these aren't the really super best examples, if we went to another area, again, the whole thing's just finding good representative images. Like this one, I guess. More or less an intact layer of cells, and by the way, what are those cells called? Satellite cells. Good. And then these guys out here, what are those called? Schwann cells. And remember we said that the cells and the fibers are segregated? Well, that means there's big fiber tracts in between the cells. So again, I'm not saying these are all wonderful examples, but here's an area you would never see this in an autonomic ganglion. So in other words, if this was sympathetic or parasympathetic ganglion, you wouldn't see that. So, intact layer of satellite cells, centrally placed nuclei, cells of neurons, somas, and fibers are segregated. Definitely that is. And by the way, where is this? This is a dorsal root ganglion. All right, so let's contrast that now. Yes. Yeah, the question is, why can we be confident that's a dorsal root ganglion? I rephrased your question a little bit, and the answer is yeah, that's the only place you're going to see primary afferents. Now, the complete answer is there are ganglia associated with cranial nerves as well, where you can see primary afferents. They're the ones that deal with like visceral afferent stuff with, that run with cranial nerves. We're not going to deal with that because that's head. Like I said, we're going to stick to from the neck down. So, you see the difference here? This nucleus, again, you have to look at the prevailing pattern. So here's one, here's one, here's one. These three examples right here, nucleus is to one side. And also remember, this is kind of like a fingerprint, right? You got to have all the criteria. Number two, you don't have an intact satellite cell layer, and that's because these are multipolar neurons. And then finally, you don't really have these big sections of fiber tracts, and instead we say the cells and fibers are mixed. So that means now that this is not a dorsal root ganglion, this is an autonomic ganglion. But my question to you, and maybe I'll drop the mag for your benefit, my question to you is this a sympathetic ganglion or a parasympathetic ganglion? What do you think? I'm going to go with sympathetic. Why? Because parasympathetic has to be in the wall of an organ. Now you could say, well, how do I know this isn't in the wall of an organ? Answer, because they're never that big in the wall of an organ. And I haven't told you that before, but so consider yourself learning new stuff now. But if you're in the wall of an organ, you might have 4 or 5 neurons. You're not gonna have hundreds like you see here. So again, always, if I would have shown you this image first, your first step would have been nervous tissue, your second step would have been peripheral nervous system, because I don't see spinal cord stuff like gray and white matter. Okay, so if it's peripheral nervous system, then all I gotta look for is the nuclei. If they're centrally placed, it's primary afferent. If they're eccentric, now I'm dealing with a postganglionic sympathetic or a postganglionic parasympathetic. In this case, I gotta decide now based on whether I'm in the wall of an organ or not. Everybody okay so far? Yeah, shout them out as you got them. Questions, that is. All right, let's again do something completely different. Tissue type? What are your 2 choices? Skeletal muscle? And is it skeletal muscle? No, because if it was skeletal muscle, and you might expect that based on the nuclei lining up the way they do, but if it was skeletal muscle, it would have to be longitudinal section, and you don't see any striations. Definitely at a high enough magnification that you should, and you don't. So it's not skeletal muscle. What's the only other possibility? So it's not a muscle then, is it? Because it's obviously not cardiac, it's not smooth. And, question. Why is this not smooth muscle? Maybe if I drop the mag a little bit, it's more convincing. Too spread out. Smooth muscle, those cells pile on top of each other, and since they're only about the width of the nucleus, that's how wide they are. If this was smooth muscle, you'd see tons more nuclei. That's why it's not smooth muscle. It occurred to me until this moment. So it's not muscle, it's not nerve, it's not epithelial, it's gotta be connective, and if it's connective, dense, regular, connective tissue. So again, we looked at skeletal muscle before in longitudinal section, so let's keep that in mind. All right. Yes? What kind of non-identification questions? That don't have any what, ID? Huh? Oh, I don't know. I'm just providing the structure. Yeah. I was gonna say, as far as I know, they're all based on histology, so there's an ID, right? So, yeah, you're asking me what kind of functional questions are there? What kind of functional questions are there?
Well, when you present a tissue, you describe its organization, components, so those are things that are conceptually related to the tissue.
Do you hear that? Yeah, what he's saying is basically the stuff I told you last week, you know, as far as like the functional stuff. Yeah, I know, who knew? I didn't know either, so, so, trust me, you guys are smart, you'll figure this out. I mean, nervous tissue, what's it do? You know, it conducts action potential. You got sympathetic, parasympathetic, all the divisions. I'm assuming that any functional question will relate to the generalities of what it does. Well, that's a decent question. All right. Okay, tissue type. Well, it's again, you know, when in doubt, it's not an epithelium because there's no lumen. You think it's nervous tissue? So, it's not muscle either, so this has got to be a connective tissue. But key feature, not many fibers. So the cells are there, but the fibers aren't. So what does that bring to mind? Mesenchyme? So that's what this is. When you see simply cells with very little to no fibers out here, that's what that's going to be, mesenchyme. Now, let's contrast that with this. Which has certainly a similar appearance. Now here's the same egg we just looked at. See the difference? The cells look, I mean, you know, you have to kind of like train your eye to this, but the cells more or less look the same as the previous image, but now we're picking up this collagen. Now, again, you still have substantial amount of ground substance, that is the clear space. And if this were a loose speck, you definitely would expect to see wandering cells, you know, more cells than this. So it's only really one cell type, and they look pretty uniform. So those are the two embryonic tissue types. All right.
So this is mucoid?
Sorry. Took it off. Let me put it back. Yes, your question.
What are we looking at?
What are you looking at? Oh, I didn't name it. Mucoid, thank you. Mucoid connective tissue. So we just compared mesenchyme versus mucoid. They're both embryonic. Okay. Okay, here's your next one. So, here's the tissue from here to here. What is it?
Where is it?
Is it stratified? Probably, right? Because again, these nuclei right out here, they have to contact the basement membrane, and there looks to be too many intervening nuclei. So it's stratified. But now the question is, just to kind of drive this point home, but we mentioned it before, these cells, how would you describe their shape through here? Columnar, right? And so in this case, it's not transitional because the long axis of the rectangle is perpendicular to the basement membrane. So this is a stratified columnar epithelium. So I just want to really just make those points known. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah, they're not really ciliated, that's just debris. So, sorry. Yeah, I can't control this stuff, so maybe I can. Maybe I could have gotten an area where it wasn't, but. Follow-up question, go ahead. Okay, so hold your follow-up question until I show you the lookalikes, okay? So, but yeah, I will address that. I've got that in mind. Okay, just give me a second to think here. Okay, so what are we gonna do next? Oh, this will mess them up. Let's do this one. Okay, this one's pretty challenging. Okay, I'm gonna start, I could go higher, but I'm not going to yet, quite yet. I'm gonna start with this question. Here is a tissue down here, and here is a tissue up here. Are they the same? No, they look different, I agree. So let's start with this tissue down here. Now we'll go a little higher magnification. What is that? Skeletal muscle. It's got the nuclei on the periphery. Really, you never see that. Okay, so that's skeletal muscle. This little oh boy. Yeah, I gotta get a little careful here. Drop it. So if I go to an area like, I guess this will work. What do you call this as a structure? You're gonna be, you can see it. I'll repeat the question. What do you call this as a structure? Perimysium. Why? Because it's got muscle on both sides. If it was on the outside, you'd call it an epimysium. And now, by definition, what tissue type comprises the perimysium? Dense, irregular. I don't care what it looks like. It's by definition, it's dense, irregular. Okay, I digress. Let me drop the mag. I believe we all agreed that this up here was something completely different. And like I said, I agree with that. And so my question to you is, well, what is it? I'll show you the contrast here. So, your first guess would be, well, probably skeletal muscle cut in cross-section, except no, that's skeletal muscle cut in cross-section. That's something else. Now, you may be sitting there going, I had no idea what that is. So go through your checklist. It's not an epithelium, right? Definitely not. It's not nerve, so not epithelium, not nerve. Muscle, let's hold that in abeyance, or connective tissue. So at least we've narrowed it down to 2. Now, you guys use your brains now. Think contextually. That means, what's the context here? You've got a skeletal muscle next to something that is not a skeletal muscle. So what's in the vicinity of skeletal muscles? Like bone, agreed. Is this bone? Is this bone? I hadn't even thought you'd be confused that this was bone. Sorry, I underestimated you. I apologize. It's enough with love, you don't know with love, right? So, that is not bone, because those cells are not in lacuna, and I will convince you of that in just a moment. It's not bone, but good thinking. So if it's not bone, what's the other thing that's associated with skeletal muscle? Tendon. Exactly. But that's not tendon that we've seen before, is it? Well, or is it? So it's not longitudinal. That's tendon in cross-section. That is dense, regular effect in cross-section. Probably the toughest thing we've looked at today. But think context. So, another takeaway from all this, don't panic. Just, if you don't know something, just think about it a little bit. So, that is tendon cut in cross-section. But, this issue of bone is definitely a good thing to think about. So here's a big tendon. Here's what's going on. You got a tendon running right through muscle. So, let me drop the mag even further just so you can find this easily. Yeah, here's bone. you see how, and we'll even go to the same magnification. Cells in lacuna. Now, lacuna can look different. It's our obligation to present you with images where they definitely look like they're spaces. So when the cells are situated in a white space, surrounded by a white space, those are osteocytes sitting in lacuna. Okay? We good? All right. All right, we're gonna just go right to the line here. Here's your next question. See this thing right here? What is that called? As we kind of just do a sine wave like this, what is that called? Maybe I know it's not multiple. Is it multiple choice? It is multiple choice. Okay, so A, is it a collagen fiber? B, reticular fiber? C, I was trying to work it so it would be E, none of the above, because I always like those when I'm not crazy to use them. So, but C, is it an elastic fiber? I just couldn't think of any fiber names. Yeah, that's elastic fiber. And what makes an elastic fiber? Because it's of uniform width, number one. Number two, it kind of does the sine wave appearance, more or less. That is an elastic fiber. Now, question. Is this an elastic fiber? Give me a second. Right here. Okay. So, are these guys elastic fibers right here? Because they're too, in fact, let's increase our magnification. There's too much variability here. So these are individual collagen fibers. Now, what kind of cell is that right there? Is that a fibroblast? No, that's a smooth muscle cell. Are these guys fibroblasts? Yes. So the point is, be careful about, look for the staining differences. So this is smooth muscle, this is dense, irregular connective tissue. So, as we look around here a little bit, what's that? Actually, you know what? Let me find a better example. Sorry about that. That's a better example. What do you call that? Or that. They're both the same thing.
I believe so, yeah.
Huh. Well, this is something completely different. So is that nervous tissue or anything like that? That's a gland. So, remember glands, we said there's serous acinus, mucus acinus, or the combination mucus acinus with the serous stemulum. Which one's that, mucus or serous? That's mucus. Again, what's the difference? Basally placed nuclei, very dark, light staining cytoplasm, as opposed to this one, dark cytoplasm, nuclei aren't as flat, and in some sections, depends on the staining, they can look, pretty light staining as well. So this is the serous look, this is the mucus look. Okay, now, having said that, you probably can't see this, but here's a cell right here. I'm not gonna go to oil emerging, but I don't know if you can see just the little light area. There's like this little halo right here next to the nucleus. Does that help? Remember those connective tissue cells? That's called a plasma cell. A mast cell, remember, is the one that kind of has a red granular type cytoplasm. So if we came over here, for example, again, if we're going to ask you a question like this, we'll go to higher magnification for sure. Well, I'm not sure we're going to find one, but let me just bear with me for a second. So question, what is the name of this cell right here? What do you call that? Well, part of this involves, what is this? You see how those are red blood cells? So that must be a endothelial cell. Next question. What do you call that cell? That nucleus represents a cell type best described as what? Can't go, hopefully you can see this. So I guess the relevant question is that a blood vessel? And the answer is no, it's not. So these are myelinated axons. So now, with that heightened appreciation, what's the name of that cell? That's a Schwann cell. Question, what is the name of that cell type? Is that a Schwann cell? I'll help you out. No. So, it's not part of these myelinated axons. This is on the edge. So, what do you think? Fibroblast. What is this structure that surrounds this group of myelinated axons, forming a structure we could call a fascicle? What is this thing? Perinurium. Yeah, right. Okay, so I want you to picture this. Picture a big nerve that's got an epinurium, perinurium, and a bunch of individual fascicles. As that nerve approaches a target tissue, it starts to break up, and the individual fascicles go to their destinations still surrounded by connective tissue. You call that connective tissue as a structure a perinurium, and as a tissue type, it's dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, so that's probably something to write down. Okay, so let's keep this going.
I thought those were red blood cells.
Okay, so what kind of an epithelium is this? From ear to ear. Well, remember, this looks kind of bizarre, especially because this stuff out here So this is stratified squamous, completely keratinized. And so as a layer, what do you call this stuff right here? I'll start you off. Stratum corneum. This layer right here, what's that? Stratum granulosum, this is spinosum, and this is basale. Hey, what's the name of that cell right there? I'll tell you this, it's a part of the basale. That is a melanocyte. Key feature. Going to be in the stratum basale or close to it. These will tend to show up to you in basale. Here's another one up here. It's always surrounded by kind of like a halo, very light staining, just cytoplasm doesn't stain. The rest of the cells are more or less called keratinocytes, but this one's called a melanocyte. All right, so if we've established that, the pointer is now in a layer best described as, so if this is the epidermis, what is this? Get it on top of the what? Dermis, good. But the dermis has two layers. Which one is this? Well, it's called the papillary layer. The reticular layer is the one that's got the denser collagen. And remember I told you these things are called dermal papillae, and hopefully that will help you to understand and remember the name papillary. The reticular layer starts right here. This is the reticular layer, coarser collagen. They're both dense, irregular effect, but it's just the size of the collagen. All right. So I'm going to just on this same slide come down here. Keep going. What is that? Now you got to have, this is context driven. So you would have had to be established that this is skin. And in fact, I guess to really be fair, what you would see is an image perhaps like this, with this thing in view. That's a hair follicle. So again, what do you think these guys are? Sebaceous gland, apocrine sweat glands, or eccrine sweat glands? Which ones? I'm going to go with apocrine too. Those are apocrine sweat glands. Sebaceous glands, on the other hand, if we follow this hair follicle up, those are sebaceous glands. Notice centrally placed nuclei, very light staining cytoplasm. Those two always associated with hair follicles. But again, we're going to keep moving here, and we're going to come down to this area. Let's look at this in higher magnification. What tissue type is this? First of all, it's a lumen, so it's got to be an epithelium. So that means this is stratified. Well, no, it's an epithelium, sorry. And now, is it simple or stratified? It's stratified because these cells can't contact the basement membrane. But what shape are the surface cells? Cuboidal. This is a stratified cuboidal. As a structure, what is this called? So that's the tissue type. As a structure, that is a duct of an eccrine sweat gland. These are the secretory portions of an eccrine sweat gland. So stratified cuboidal is the duct. This kind of simple arrangement here, pyramidal type cells, that's the secretory part. Okay? All right. Yeah, other than the looking different part, yeah, that's how I tell them apart, because they look different. So the key thing is, how do they look different? Sebaceous, again, they have that very light cytoplasm, centrally placed nucleus. Apocrine have a kind of darker nucleus, or sorry, darker cytoplasm that's more like reddish staining, and it's a columnar, so it's kind of like a simple columnar. And, so there's the distinct lumen, and the nucleus is more or less in the middle of the cell. So those are the distinguishing features of that. Now, in this case, here's my first question, and that is, I guess let's go to higher mag. What is the name of this tissue? Hang on just a second. So here's the lumen. So what's the name of this tissue? So it's a lumen, right? So it's got to be an epithelium. So I think we're getting pretty good at this. Oh, but I see goblet cells. Is that pseudostratified? No, it's not pseudostratified. You know why? Because first of all, it really does look simple columnar right here, which it is. And also, this red line along the surface, what do those represent? Is that cilia? Or in fact, is it microvilli? So this is an example of where you can have a simple columnar epithelium with goblet cells. But the key feature is, remember we said if it's pseudostratified, you've got to have ciliated cells. These are not ciliated cells. Instead, you have this red line that's called the striated border. Okay? Now, we saw cilia before, but now what I want to show you is the other one. Surface specializations. Actually completed that sentence, so just give me a second. All right, here it is right here. So we would probably show you this magnification instead of clear about it. Okay, let's not even name this epithelium just because it'll confuse you, but these things right here, those are stereocilia. What's different? Both cilia, first of all, microvilli are too small to be seen individually. Cilia are, you can see them, but they're all uniform in length, and they kind of fill the surface of, the whole apical surface of the cell is covered. These are more wispy looking, and actually they're longer. They extend further into the lumen. So those are called stereocilia. Right? All right. Okay, this is going to take a little talking, just to make this clear. If I told you that this was the stomach, and then we moved across here like so, came to this edge of the tissue section, increased our magnification, and then I pointed to these cells right here. Again, this is really putting your gross anatomy knowledge to use. What would you call that, first of all, as a tissue? Skeletal muscle, not even close. I don't think I explained myself well. So let me start over with this. This is the stomach. That's the lumen. No. We're learning here. So this is the muscle. This is smooth muscle cut cross section. This is smooth muscle cut longitudinal section, but we're going below that And I'm asking now, we're on the very outside of this order. So, maybe I should have started as so as a generic tissue type, it's got one cell layer thick, it's squamous, it would be a simple squamous. But remember there's some specialty names here? This is called mesothelium. And remember, as a structure, it's the visceral peritoneum. So, you're not going to be held accountable for this, but just remember that when it comes to the peritoneum, the pleura, or the pericardium, that is the serous pericardium, those cells that make up that are called mesothelial cells. The tissue is called the mesothelium, and the structure is, visceral peritoneum, something like that. That's why I said it was going to kind of have some talk. Now, we were doing surface specializations, and did I address your question? What was your question again? It was about surface specializations, right? You want to see microvilli? Well, you know what? We're going to look at them again, though. Because, no, you earned it. You have earned it. You've taken my abuse for an hour, so I'm going to give you. You want to see the pyloric sphincter? Less than that. So, wait a minute, you know what? Maybe not. Maybe I can do this for you. Yeah. I'll show you the pyloric sphincter in a second. But you want to see microvilli. And so here it is. Because I think it's a point that I perhaps did not drive home enough. So I'm going to show you a slightly different image. So the point is this is as good as it's going to get magnification-wise, and microvilli are just too small to be seen. At the same magnification, because kind of keep in mind the goblet cells, are a certain size. If these were cilia, you would see them extending certainly a lot further, and you could resolve them into this kind of like brush-like thing. Okay? So that's the difference between microvilli and cilia. All right. So, just look at the notes for a second. I've done what I set out to do. Okay, so let's start with this. What's the tissue type? That's pretty basic, right? That's nervous tissue. So, where are we? The central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system? Central nervous system. Okay, the point of my question, though, was at looking from this to this, what spinal segment is that?
That's lumbar. Probably all four.
What do you think? Lumbar, I agree. Why? Because it's got a ventral enlargement, and you come back here, and it's got relatively little dorsal white matter. Okay, good. Let's increase our mag a little bit. So, assuming that we're in the ventral horn, which we are, what do you call these cells right here? What is that cell called? Alpha motor neuron. particular preparation doesn't really stain prominently, so we'd have to go just basically on size. And so the smaller guys, such as, but maybe something like that, that's a gamma motor neuron. So again, the distinguishing features are alphas have coarser nissel, larger cell, gammas are smaller, but they do have discernible cytoplasm. Now, let's drop our mag even further. Let's try another spinal segment. Which one's that? No ventral enlargement. So you got two choices, sacral or thoracic. Which are you gonna go with? Definitely thoracic, right? Sacral would have far less white matter. So having said all of that, if we now come in here, we increase our mag right about this vicinity, and I didn't change the slide, so the slide is, if we look around a little bit, what is the name of that cell right here? What kind of a, I'll give you a hint, it's a neuron. So what kind of a neuron is it? Is that a preganglionic sympathetic motor neuron? Oh, you want to see where we are again? Sure. It was this guy right here. I repeat the question. Is that a preganglionic sympathetic motor neuron? No. Why? Because preganglionic sympathetic motor neurons are out here in the lateral horn. That's not where we are. We're right here. Also, did you notice this? This thing's got an eccentric nucleus. What is the one example of an eccentric nucleus in the central nervous system? I guess we can cover over that quickly. It's called the dorsal nucleus of Clark. That is a dorsal nucleus of Clark neuron. Well, just saved it to the review to show it to you. Okay, so, hey, back here, if I were successful at finding a neuron, I'm not saying I'm gonna be. Well, let me ask you this question. I'll do it as a word question. If I'm in the dorsal horn and I find a neuron, what's it called? By definition. Dorsal horn, neuron, interneuron. Okay. Okay, this is kind of, this reminds us of old days, you know, the good old days, like i.e. 1 week ago when we started this. What is that? Astrocyte? No. Look at where the needle, look at where the pointer is. This cell, I'm pointing to that. That is an axon. Where is the nucleus right now, or where's the pointer right now? Axon hillock. Where is this? That is that's a dendrite. So that's what missile substance looks like. So let's move over here a little bit. Now, let's see. So cell called? First of all, is that a neuron? No, that's a glial cell. Review your glial cells. The one that has a round euchromatic nucleus like this one, that is a oligodendrocyte. The ones that have darker, more irregular nuclei, either this one or that one, are astrocytes. When they're flat and dark, that's called a microglial cell. Don't necessarily see one. They're kind of hard to find. Just make sure you're not looking at a blood vessel, because if it's a blood vessel like these guys here, a flat dark cell would be an endothelial cell. But a microglial cell will simply be a flat cell just sitting out there, like maybe that one. Oh, that's probably the one right there, microglial cell. Flat and dark. All right, and if it lines the central canal, it's called an appendable cell. Okay, now, so epithelium, I think we kind of went over that well. So in other words, the 8 types, the simple 4, pseudostratified being the sort of unusual one, but simple squamous. If it lines a blood vessel, it's called an endothelium. If it's on the outside of an organ that's covered by peritoneum, it's called the mesothelial cell. Other than that, everything else is just simple squamous. You have simple cuboidal, simple columnar. So you pretty much have got that pseudostratified. And then, so those are the epithelial types. I'm just kind of making sure I've shown you everything. The muscle types, the one thing that we kind of didn't do is skeletal muscle and cross section is really pretty simple, I suppose, because of the nuclei. Smooth muscle cut and cross section, you know, you're always going to have the context because it's next to longitudinal muscle. But something like this, on the other hand, let me just give you an example. This one can kind of be a challenge. So if we now go into this area. So this is what I want you to remind yourself. Cardiac muscle looks like this. So one of the key features is it's centrally placed nucleus, that nuclei. So that's how you immediately distinguish it from skeletal, because it's peripheral nuclei for skeletal, centrally placed for cardiac. What makes this not smooth muscle cross section is because there's sufficient cytoplasm surrounding the nucleus. So it's a centrally placed nucleus, but it doesn't fill, the nucleus that is, doesn't fill the entire cell profile. So the muscle types, make sure you can see them in the 2 orientations. Now, with nervous tissue, what we talked about was central nervous system versus peripheral. For its peripheral, it's either a sympathetic or parasympathetic ganglion, depending on whether you're in the organ or not, or dorsal root ganglion. You get that. Central nervous system, it's really just all the spinal cord anatomy that we did as far as the different cell types. Now, the other thing that we really didn't talk about, but I'll show you now, is this. And this is nerve cut in longitudinal section. So as we increase our magnification here, let's take stock of some features. So the axons now are going to be the purple things. So like here, for example, here is a myelinated axon. I know it's myelinated because it's got clear spaces on either side. The nuclei over here, those would be Schwann cells. Now the other thing about a nerve cut in longitudinal section like this is you might have the possibility of seeing a node of Ranvier. And the node of Ranvier is simply, I'm just kind of looking for a good one. is where, as I'll show you, you just gotta get a little bit stretch where it's all nice and longitudinal. So, kind of as you see, when you see them kind of indent like this, that's nodes of Ron. So, again, these are probably not the best examples, but keep in mind what you're looking at here. No neurosomas, it'll just be the axons, and again, in longitudinal section, it'll look like this. Now, in cross-section, we have to deal with these layers. So we have epinurium, perinurium, and endo would be the little bit of connective tissue that surrounds each Schwann cell. We have skeletal muscle with the comparable epimesium, perimesium, and endomesium, and then finally tendinium. So remember, all of those tissues, for the most part, are fibroelastic connective tissue, and they're actually, as a tissue type, dense irregular. All right, so let's kind of do the following right now. And I'm going to show you some things that you really haven't looked at, but I think you can now start to reason your way through this. So just bear with me for a second. All right, let's look at this. I'm going to start with this blue right here. And we've done this before, and so this is, I'm kind of doing something different here. This is a stratified epithelium. You might say, oh, these are columnar cells, but again, you have these cells right on the surface, and notice the nuclei are not flat, so this is not a stratified squamous, this is transitional. So, once you've identified something as transitional epithelium, when we get to the spring, what you're going to say is, well, transitional epithelium has a rather limited distribution. It's either in a calyx of the kidney, it's in the ureter, or it's in the bladder. Now, as we drop our magnification, what we're going to see is, as we go down here a little deeper, we're going to have this, which we're going to recognize as connective tissue. If we go down here a little bit further, we're going to see this connective tissue really kind of opens up. And so we're going to see that it's pretty reasonable to think of these being two distinct layers. Later on, you'll learn the term lamina propria, and then this lesser area is called submucosa. And then we come to a tissue that hopefully you recognize as well. And this is smooth muscle in longitudinal section. And you got here far enough. This is smooth muscle crosscut. And so what you're going to observe is that in this case, this is actually inner longitudinal, outer circular, which is, just don't worry about this too much, but it's going to help you to identify this is urinary system. So you have the epithelium, and then you have this observation. Let's drop our mag even further. And so what I'm trying to show you is, and then you come back out here and it's going to be just connective tissue. Well, you just figured out how an organ worked. And that is, it's the sum of all the basic tissues. So you're dealing with an organ, which I'm going to show you again, you know, probably like in April, I think, when we do the urinary system. And you're going to see that, okay, it's transitional, you'll have to know that. And then you'll note that this, unlike the ureter, this organ has a submucosa, which is this open area, whereas a ureter only has this, which is a lamina propria. So we're going to use these tissues to see that's how you identify this as an organ. Let me show you another example. Okay, this is gonna be something that you're gonna see about a year from now. And you're gonna look at this, and you're gonna see now at higher magnification, that, okay, that's definitely a simple columnar, and you're gonna say, wow, are those goblet cells? And then you're gonna remember, no, it can't possibly be goblet cells, because every single one of them has this mucus. So you're gonna see this as a simple columnar epithelium, but you're gonna figure out these are called mucus columnar cells, and you're gonna understand this is the stomach. In fact, you're gonna understand this is something called, one portion of the stomach called the pyloric stomach. Now, as you look around here, yeah, you know it's coming. So, if you look around here, you're gonna see that this epithelium transitions from this to this, and then this layer of smooth muscle right here, all of that, you're gonna say, gee, I wonder what a thickened area of smooth muscle between the stomach and small intestine is called. And you're gonna say, hey, I know what that is. That's the pyloric sphincter. See, so we're building organs here. Now, how do you know this is something different? Because look at the epithelium. See how the epithelium looks completely different? Now, true, it's gonna be simple columnar, but it's gonna be thrown into these folds out here. So again, another example of an organ. Let me just show you one more thing, or actually two more things. And that is, take a look at this. Now this is pretty low magnification, so here's a little higher. And in fact, here's a little higher. And as you look around, you're gonna say, well, this looks a lot like an exocrine gland to me. And why? Because these are serous acini, I know that, whereas this is a duct. And so as you look around, you're gonna say, well, you know what, here's the duct and longitudinal section right here, and you're gonna learn how there's different names of ducts and so forth. But as we look around here, we're also gonna see an occasional, find it. So what we're gonna find is an occasional, an occasional one of these, which that's a mucus ascites. So we're gonna take stock of the fact that, gee, most of the things that we're looking at here are primarily serous acini, but there are a few mucus acini, and so we're gonna know, because we saw a few mucus acini, that that's definitely not the pancreas, and instead, just by the virtue of recognizing these different acini, we're gonna recognize that this is actually the parotid gland. Now the other thing we're gonna do, this is again about a year from now, is as we look around, we're gonna see in these little connective tissue areas here, that these are big ducts, but also, hey, look, these are blood vessels. So we're gonna study all the different types of blood vessels as well. And again, always look at the interior. But the first thing that we're gonna do in the spring, and now you're already equipped to do this, so pretty happy about that. So let me just show you what we're able to do here. So you're gonna be exposed to an image that looks like this. And we're gonna increase our mag a little bit. Look at something like this. Get some more light on this. And you're gonna take a look at this, and believe it or not, you're gonna have no problem identifying this as cardiac muscle tissue. And so you're gonna come to appreciate that, gee, instead of my idea of cardiac muscle being all over in the heart, it's actually not. It's restricted to what's called the myocardium. And I've got this surface to look at, and I've got this surface down here to look at. And as we move along, one of the things we're going to appreciate is, well, there's reasons why this one's actually called the epicardium, and there's reasons why this one is called the endocardium. But again, we're going to be talking about elastic fibers, which are stained black here. So my point is, with this tissue stuff that you know, not only are you going to ace this quiz on Friday, but you're going to remember this because when I see you again in March, we're going to start using this tissue stuff to understand how organs are composed. So I got to be honest with you. If you understood most of what happened during this review, I think you're in excellent shape for this quiz. So as Dr. Fleet said, what you should do in the meantime is take a look again at these images, because those were selected as good examples of everything. Make sure you can identify this. But it starts with your understanding that each and every cell type, tissue type, and structure all has a description, and so in your mind's eye, make sure that you know these things. So that's just kind of book knowledge. But then the point is, look at these images, see if you can see these in the labeled images, and then test yourself with the problem sets. You have my email address. Please email me if you have any questions. But unfortunately, this ends my kind of stint with you, at least in the fall. You have a question?
Yeah, you show us some bone.
The first 20 questions were on bone on the quiz, right? You told me don't show them bone. 21, yeah. Yes, I can show you bone. So you interrupted me, man. I was doing my farewell speech here. So anyway. All right. Come on, back to your farewell speech. Making me work all the way to 3, aren't you? Okay. That's okay. There was something lacking in the presentation. Okay. Okay, so dried ground bone. This is the one where you see these black things here. Those are called, let's look at this in higher mag. Those guys are called lacuna. So that is a lacuna. These little guys right here are called canaliculi. So the cells that lie in lacuna are called osteocytes. Now, question. This structure is called what? What is that called? They're called perversion systems. They're made up of these things which form a particular kind of lamella. They're called concentric lamellae. So the lamellae that make up perversion systems are called concentric lamellae. Now, the lamellae in between adjacent perversion systems. So as we look around a little bit, we'll see an area maybe like this. It's not part of this one, or this one, or this one, or this one. It's in between. Those are called interstitial lamellae. The hole in the middle of a perversion system is called a perversion canal. Let me show you these same things when it comes to a decalcified section. So let me find my slide here. All right, so in this case, let's go through the life stages of one of these aversion systems. It starts with this, which is called a resorption canal. That's what this thing is right here. These cells are called osteoclasts. In this case, it's not going to really be lined by osteoblasts, and that's why you know this is a resorption canal. As opposed to this, the one right here, where you'll notice that the cells now lining this bone surface, these are now an intact layer of osteoblasts. And you'll notice that because there's a cement line right here, this haversian system has started to fill in. But it's called an immature haversian system because there's still room for further growth. When you come to an example like this one, in which the hole is smaller and it's lined by squamous osteoblasts, that's called a mature haversian system. Now, the basic cell, the osteocyte, again, lies in lacuna. But when now you come to the edges of bone, for example, on the outside edge, this is the periosteum. And when you have a space like this, you have to look around. Is there any cement line around this? And the answer for this one is no. And similarly, as you look at this over here, the answer for this one is no as well. No cement line. When you see that, you call that a primary canal, different from a haversian canal. So cement line really becomes a pretty important observation. But when you come to the interior, that is the marrow cavity, this is marrow, this is the endosteum, and you might expect to see more primary canals in here. But also remember this other term. It's called a Volkmann's canal. It's where you have this indentation into the bone matrix, usually from a marrow cavity. And it's the pathway by which blood vessels run inside to gain access to primary canals as well as haversian canals. Yeah, here's the really nice one right here. So this is a nice Volkmann's canal right here. All right. It's hard to visualize these things, but remember the diaphysis of a bone is essentially inner circumferential lamellae, that's what these guys would be. Outer circumferential lamellae, that's what's deep to the periosteum. And then what you have is in the middle of the bone cortex, where all the haversian systems are, stuff that's in between adjacent haversian systems. Again, it's called interstitial lamellae, like that would be this right here, versus the ones that make up haversian systems, like this one right here. Those are called concentric. So lamellae come in those four types. So when you look at a section of a long bone, you basically have, we've dealt with the cells, you have the haversian systems versus primary canals. With haversian systems, you have the different stages: resorption canal, immature haversian system, mature, and then you have those different types of lamellae. Now, the other thing, I suppose, that is possible challenge, and that is when you deal with the bone development itself. Find this. Is we have this, an image that looks like this, which is the epiphyseal plate. And if you recall, the epiphyseal plate has zones to it. This is called the zone of reserve cartilage. So this is a tissue type of something we didn't really, formally talk about, but this is called hyaline cartilage. And this is the zone of reserve cartilage. Where the cells line up in rows like this is called proliferation. We increase our mag just to get a little more detail here. So we just come in here a little bit. This is proliferation here. This is where they enlarge. That's called hypertrophy. So this stuff would be hypertrophy right here. And then this stuff over here, this would be where the cartilage first calcifies, then is destroyed, and is replaced with this brown stuff, which is bone. And so that's the zone of calcified cartilage and bone deposition. So when it comes to bone, you have that dry ground preparation to look at. So take a look at those pictures. But most of them are the decalcified ones. We also looked at spicules and stuff like that. That was simply to illustrate the cell types. But besides the structures, within like the diaphysis of a long bone that we just described, the other thing is this bone formation, and again, this would be an example of what's called endochondral ossification. That is, starts with a cartilage precursor versus the stuff that we saw when we looked at spicules. There was no cartilage, so it's simply called intramembranous. So those are kind of the relevant features of bone. All right. You guys have any other things that we need to look at before we quit? Anybody? Yes.
Can you go through the difference between the submucosal plexus and the myoteric?
Sure. Yeah, I got you. So the question is submucosal plexus versus myoteric plexus. And as soon as I find the slide, I'll show it to you. Okay, so this is one of these where you kind of have to know something about organs just to understand the names. And so I had used this illustration just because this was obviously a epithelium, a mucosa, and this connective tissue down here, which is going to be dense, irregular connective tissue, is loaded with nervous structures. Now, oftentimes, when you look at a connective tissue, you may see like nerves and so forth, but what you're not going to see is neurons. And so what makes this special is that you're actually looking at neurons. So let me find an example for you. Again, bear with me. So again, having said that we're surrounded by connective tissue, if you see something that looks like this, in which it's like a pocket of tissue that looks completely different. So these are blood vessels, those are the red blood cells, but these are neurons. So technically you would call it a ganglion, but in this case, because we're in the wall of a GI tract organ, it's called a plexus, and in this case, this one's called the submucosal plexus. So key features, submucosal plexus is going to be surrounded by dense irregular connective tissue. We drop our mag now, even further, this is where we were, so that's the mucosa, we were down here in the submucosa. And if we go down here, so now we can recognize smooth muscle, and if we go down here to this interface between this, which is muscle cut in one way, and this is cross cut, these nervous structures here in between, again, a pocket of something that looks completely different like this. In fact, if we look along this interface, maybe we'll see some examples of actual neurons in here, like this one. So again, let's look at this in a little higher magnification. So in this case, because we're surrounded by smooth muscle, preferably of two different orientations, but we've got collections of neurons, well, that one's called the myoteric. So that's submucosal, and submucosa surrounded by dense irregular fat, and when you're associated with smooth muscle, and again, you'd have to be told this is an organ of the GI tract, because, you know, honestly, it's not fair, you guys don't know that yet. This time next year, you'll clearly identify that, but that's how you do that. Are there any other questions that I can deal with? No? Well, all right, listen, it was nice to meet all of you. I look forward to seeing you again in the spring. So thank you for your great attendance, your attention and all that. I really appreciate it. So again, don't hesitate to reach out with any of your questions, and I'll stick around and answer questions today. But anyway, I know you're going to do fine on your quiz. So see you soon. Thank you.